This video is brought to you with the support of TrueFire. Learn, practice, and play with TrueFire. Hi, this is Keith Williams. Welcome to 5-Watt World, where we're interested in help you get the most music from the least gear. I spent a good piece of last year down a rabbit hole researching the magical Fender brown panel amps. My own electric guitar journey was deeply influenced by the tones of the first three ZZ Top records. Many have talked about Billy Gibbons using a brown panel deluxe on those records. And so this year, I went all in and spent months playing the Fender Stapleton Princeton reissue, a Sir Ombre, and an Origin Effects Deluxe 61 pedal. Along the way, it hit me that these brown combos were the first guitar amps that were the form of all combo guitar amps to come. So let's talk brown panel, and specifically let's talk about the new combos that Leo Fender and his team cooked up at the beginning of the 60s. If you've always been curious about these amps, then stay tuned, because this is the 5-Watt World short history of the magical Fender brown panel combo amps. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe, or grab a t-shirt, hoodie, or a Stomp preset pack to support what we do. And to become a bigger part of 5-Watt World, sign up for the Friends of 5-Watt on Patreon. There's a friend level to suit any budget. The links are in the description. Most of the changes in the late 50s Fender Tweed amps were circuit-based, but going into the 60s, everything was about to change. The familiar model names were the only anchor. Almost everything else changed with the introduction of slant-back cabinets, front-mounted control panels, dual channels, and most visibly, the extra rugged fabric-backed Tolex covering. Fender's first amp with forward-facing control panel and Tolex covering was the Vibrasonic. It first appeared in 1959, the year before we think of as the big switch to the new style of combos that would change all amp designs to come. Leo Fender enlisted famous players like Johnny Cash's guitarist Carl Perkins for input. One of the most famous pictures to capture this is of Perkins playing a gold Jazzmaster into the new slant front combo style amp with a blank faceplate early in 1959. This amp, shown with a rough tan finish, is widely believed to be a prototype of the new Vibrasonic design. It's interesting to note that the knobs in the amp are the ones that would be later used on the Jaguar and other short-scale guitars introduced around that time. That Vibrasonic was first seen by dealers at the Summer '59 NAMM show, and it's long been rumored that although the other designs were on display there at the show, their cabinets may have been empty. Full production of the majority of the line did not start until January of 1960. Beyond the new combo amp design, several of the new models featured a new piggyback, cab, and head design. But it's the combos I'm mostly interested in here, as the new form factor introduced then for the first time has come to mean guitar amp to most of us today. Before this, the amps that you can point to either had top-mounted or even rear-mounted controls. Remember that into the late 50s, amplifiers were less guitar amplifiers than they were just amplifiers of anything that needed to be plugged in. Bands were certainly running the guitar, but also the lead singer's mic through the same amp. It wasn't uncommon to see an input labeled accordion even. There weren't two different inputs to give the guitarist different voicing choices here. There were two inputs to handle both guitar players, or four inputs to handle the guitar player's bass and vocals. Now, Leo Fender had a long history of listening to local musicians in the Southern California country scene for input on his guitars and amps. Though Leo famously didn't play guitar himself, he was smart enough to hire gigging players like Freddie Tavares into key positions within the company. He listened to them and integrated their working needs into his designs. The earliest examples of the new amps had a light brown or tan color with a slightly pinkish hue, but in less than a year, the next batch of Tolex to come in would change to a more milk chocolate color along with a darker oxblood grill cloth. Later, the grill cloth would move to a wheat color. The switch to Tolex, a new vinyl material that had just become popular, was simply more durable and better for gigging use than the previous lacquered tweed. The 1960 catalog showed the new large combo amps covered in Tolex while still offering the smaller amps in tweed covering. The full brown panel line will be rolled out in '61, including the smaller brown Tolex combos like the Deluxe and the larger brown piggyback head and cabs we'll see later. The Fender logo was also moved to the grille on the front, and round knobs replaced the long-used chicken head knobs of the Tweed era. Interestingly, the move to the new format was not a clean line. Like many things in Fender's history, old parts were used up before moving to the new designs. So in 1960, both the Champ and Basement amps remained in the line in full tweed livery until the cabinets at Fender were used up. The evolution of the amps across these years can be put into three categories. the expansion of the line, the evolution of the cabinets and control panels, and a new approach to the circuits in the G series. Another striking change were the addition of multiple channels with their own tone knobs. Prior to this, you'd most often have multiple inputs all sharing the same tone knob. The Tweed amps that have been produced since 1948 had become increasingly more efficient, powerful, and more geared towards the solid body electric guitars. As the amps were being used for a variety of inputs and overdriven amps really weren't a thing until later in the 60s, clean power was the goal of amplification at the time. This would continue into the black Tolex amps in the mid-60s through the late 70s. In this video, I'm focusing on a couple of brown Tolex combo amps of the period, the Princeton and the Deluxe. This is mainly because there are current factory versions of these amps out in the market today. Some of the most visible amps from this time are likely the piggyback blonde amps. These were Fender's first move to a separate head and cabinet design, nicknamed as such because the heads were piggybacked on the cabinet, attaching with a pair of clip bars and knurled thumb screws. You needed those clips if you wanted to use another of the innovations, the tilt-back legs. By tilting the cabinet back, it improved the monitoring on stage, helping the players hear what was heading out to the audience. The piggyback amps came in 4 configurations: the Showman, the Bassman, the Bandmaster, and the Tremolux. These higher-powered amps became mainstays for the 60s Rolling Stones and The Who. Famously, The Who's first album released in the US as The Who Sings My Generation saw Pete Townsend running his Rickenbacker 6 and 12-string guitars into a blonde Fender Bassman head through a Marshall 4x12 speaker cabinet, a crushing combination employed by many early British bands that had access to the early Marshall cabs. See my video on blonde, black, and silver Bassman amps for more details on these, as they shared much of the same circuit topology across the piggyback models. I reached out to TrueFire to be my sponsor because I'd used them for years. I'm currently having fun going through Adam Levy's Pocket Rhythm course. With over 2 million users worldwide, whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced level player, TrueFire has lessons to enhance and inspire your playing. Get 35% off courses using the promo code 5watt35, or like I do, sign up for the All Access Pass to use the entire TrueFire catalog. I really like TrueFire, and I think if you give them a shot, you'll like them too. Sign up using the link in the description to support 5Watt World and get some great lessons at the same time. I'd like to thank TrueFire for their support in making this video. Besides the form factor changes to the cabinets, 2 major changes to the circuits during this time were in pursuit of clean power: the use of negative feedback and the move from cathode to fixed biasing of the power tubes. This is on the edge of my knowledge, so I turn to my friend David Barber for input on how to talk about this. Negative feedback is sending some of the signal out of phase back into the circuit. This reduces gain and hence signal distortion. Fender had begun experimenting with negative feedback on the Tweed Twin and Bassman amps, but we see it showing up as a new direction in the early 60s brown panel amps, increasing in use as we get into the mid-60s black panel amps. The negative feedback tamed the raucous sound of the Tweed amps a touch, but having less than their later black panel amps, the tones here fall between Tweed and black, but more on the side of black panel amps. It's appropriate to think of bias as setting the idle of the output tubes, like setting the idle of your car. In cathode-biased amps, a resistor and capacitor network is attached to the cathode of the power tubes to set the idle. In a fixed-bias amp, a negative voltage is applied to the control grid of the power tube to set the idle. Fixed bias makes it cleaner overall because it provides you with the opportunity to get more wattage. For some of you, that last paragraph might not matter at all, so let me sum up by saying that generally fixed-bias amps also sound tighter, and cathode-biased amps are often described as more compressed and more bouncy. A lot of people hear cathode-biased as sweeter as well. The final and most changeable factor across this time were the changes to the tone stack. On a single knob tone stack, when turned all the way counterclockwise, it's shunting high frequencies to ground via a capacitor, creating a darker effect. When turned all the way clockwise, the circuit shunts high frequencies around the volume pot, letting them through, creating a brighter effect. This is how they were on both the Tweed and brown panel Princeton and Deluxe amps. But the guys at Fender were experimenting all the time. This was also a time when Fender pioneered their onboard vibrato. Before going into vibrato and tremolo, let me take a minute to define our terms, because Fender used, and mostly misused, the terms throughout their history. Tremolo is a fluctuation in volume, sound that gets quieter and louder but maintains the same pitch. Vibrato, on the other hand, refers to a modulation in pitch. Fender's tweed and black panel amps had onboard tremolo, labeled as vibrato, but some of the brown panel amps actually had the closest thing to an actual vibrato circuit. Known afterwards as harmonic vibrato, it's a complex filter effect. While pitch is being altered, it isn't a full-on vibrato effect as you get from a vibrato pedal. This was a complex circuit that required 2 additional tubes on the early amps and 3 tubes on the later brown panel amps. So you can see why it was abandoned in favor of the much less lush, but much simpler tremolo effect on the black panel amps later. The tremolo on the Princeton and Deluxe amps that I'm talking about here was a bias-based tremolo. The rising and falling was produced by altering the bias or voltage to the power tubes, effectively turning them on and off to a certain amount to create wonderfully dynamic tremolo. And finally, the combos of this era saw the inclusion of the ultimate onboard effect, the first reverb, with the very rare Reverb built in '63 and '64. Ampeg had beat Fender to the punch, being the first to include onboard reverb in their 1961 Ampeg Reverber Rocket. Fender offered their standalone reverb unit during the same period, before loading it into an amp for the first time in '63 in the Reverb. At the heart of the new amps were the new-to-Fender '60s Schumacher transformers that had replaced the triad transformers that had been used across the tweed era. Fender was also shifting their major speaker supplier across these years. Where the Super still used the Jensen P12Rs, the Deluxe had a speaker manufactured by Oxford. This was also a switch from the Alnico magnets of the Jensen to ceramic magnets in the Oxfords. This transition roughly happened across 1962. Generalizing again, the Alnico speakers had quicker breakup, more compression at higher volumes, and a slightly darker sound, where the ceramic speakers had more punch and clarity, compressed less at higher volumes, and an overall brighter sound. The Brown Panel 61 Deluxe at this point in history was a 15 to 18 watt amp, which is perfect for club gigs, breaking up at a volume that just plain works. Its simple volume and tone controls are complemented by the onboard tremolo. Notice I did say tremolo, because all of the smaller combos have that simpler bias-based tremolo. Players describe the way the bias tremolo reacts as playing the tremolo, listening to the changes in the tremolo brought on by changes in the way the player was hitting the guitar. Today we have the Sir Ombre carrying this banner in current production amps. The Ombre seems to have come about as a pet project of John Suhr's, whose love of early ZZ Top tones is well known. Billy Gibbons is very cagey about what gear he used, but an early Brown Panel Deluxe seems to have been used on much of the first 3 records. And to the extent that we can believe Billy G, he's been known for saying that he loves, quote, a Fender and a Marshall, and a Gibson with a Fender amp. That last combination hinting at his beloved '59 Les Paul nicknamed Pearly Gates, along with a Brown Panel Deluxe. The ToneQuest reports summarize the Brown Deluxe this way. The overdrive is deceptively huge. Here is the one if you like overdrive. The tone is fat, creamy, fatter sounding than a Tweed Deluxe, and nastier sounding than a black panel. Just right. You won't find a better amp in this class. Brown Deluxes are sometimes referred to as mini Marshalls for their mid-forward tones. This is probably an exaggeration. This is a case where Fender's attempt to create a clean platform rather failed to all of our benefit. While they do break up earlier than a Deluxe Reverb, they are still very responsive to rolling back the volume on the guitar for some wonderful cleans. The glory of a Brown Deluxe is a great example of how the amp is the sum of all of its parts. In a lot of ways, it's a 5E3 Tweed Deluxe, but the cabinet and speaker are completely different. It's a bigger change than it looks like on the schematic. I don't have a wide experience with the vintage amps, but I fell in love with the Ombre. It seems to me to break up at the perfect volumes for club dates, weighs in at a very light 30 pounds, even with the non-Neo speaker it has in it, and has the mids that work so well in a group. In my opinion, it's too bad that the form factor of this particular amp left the Fender catalog. The cabinet is only slightly larger than a Princeton Reverb, but sounds much larger with its larger cabinet and 12-inch speaker while still being very compact. With its tweed-style phase inverter, the Princeton is softer. The Deluxe has the early use of the long-tailed pair style phase inverter that Fender would use in the larger amps of the time, but also adopt it from that point on through the golden years of the 60s and 70s. Though it was part of Fender looking for less distortion overall, the Deluxe has an additional gain stage compared to the Princeton, which gives it more snarl. I'd predict that with the advent of the Sur Hombre, many players will discover the joys of gigging a brown panel Deluxe that never would have bought it before if it had to get a vintage piece. The Princeton amps go back to near the very beginning of Fender amp production. From 1946 to the present day, there's been a Princeton in the lineup. Starting production in the new format in '61, the brown panel Princeton was a 12-watt amp with an onboard bias tremolo. Having had an 8-inch speaker in the Tweed era, this new version got a 10-inch speaker and was the first fixed bias Princeton. Interestingly, the Princeton was the only amp that was still using a phase inverter design from the Tweed Deluxe. In many ways, this is a lightly modified and recabbed version of a late Tweed Tremolux amp. Here again, we have the bias-based tremolo that is so much fun. Like the brown panel Deluxe, there are wonderfully rich cleans at lower volumes that roll up into some great post-Tweed but not quite black panel overdrive when pushed harder. For all these circuit reasons, the Princeton is not simply a smaller version of a brown panel Deluxe with a smaller speaker and cabinet. It's its own thing, and it's for all these reasons that Chris Stapleton was drawn to the circuit when he came across an original 62 that had been modified to take a 12-inch speaker. Stapleton had loved the original brown panel Princetons, but they just weren't quite loud enough for the sort of gigs he was doing before hitting it big. But with the efficient 12-inch speaker, it was loud enough and took up very little room in the van for the endless club gigs he was doing. But a vintage amp is just that, and it takes a lot of care. So when Fender saw Stapleton's star rise, they reached out and asked if he'd like to collaborate on a modern version of the amp that he could use on the road, and not, incidentally, make a few of those for us on the way. As part of the research for All Short Histories, I try to spend time with the gear as much as possible. I grabbed a Stapleton from a buddy down in Nashville, and liked it so much I added a second one for a wet-dry rig before long in the living room. It's a great form factor, but it is a heavy little beast with the speaker that they have in it. It actually weighed in at 2 pounds more than the Hombre. But it would be oversimplifying to say that they are interchangeable. They aren't the same thing at all. I found the Stapleton stayed cleaner a little bit longer than the Hombre. I'd encourage anyone that wants to dip a toe in the brown panel world to play these both to get the best sense of where you need to land. I also had a chance to talk to Carl Carrasco of Carrasco Amps. Carl has built reproduction and improved versions of both the brown Princeton and Deluxes over the years. He said that overall the Princeton feels rounder, less strident than the Deluxe. He attributes this to the difference in the phase inverter type and the gain staging. Or, if you just can't see adding another amp to the music room, there is the Origin Effects Deluxe 61 pedal. This is an amp-in-a-box recreation of the 61 Deluxe circuit to the letter. I have it in my current little pedal board in the living room, and I find it very satisfying to play. I can scratch some of that brown panel itch running it into the front of a pair of clean amps. To be honest, I like to spend some time with the guys at Origin, talking about how they can replicate a classic tube amp with such accuracy in such a tiny box. In a world that's increasingly modeled, this is an all-analog circuit, and it's a bit of a mind-bender for me. Even the bias-based tremolo has the dynamic feel of the tube-driven circuit in the original amp. My buddy Adam Levy's all-time favorite amp, both for stage and studio work, is a 62 brown panel Deluxe, and I'm very curious to send this pedal down to him in New York to get his take on it. So that gives you 3 distinct price points to try some brown panel goodness. The Stapleton Princeton at $25.99, the Sur Ombre at $16.49, and the Origin Deluxe pedal at $4.59. And that's the recounting of this past year's fascination with the brown panel era Fender combos. It all started well before the basement video, and goes all the way back to my experience with Deluxes. I'm always looking for that perfect 12 to 20 watt combo that has the mojo that just works for me. You might find what you're looking for in one of these same brown Tolex combos. Just saying. I need to thank Jeff Mackerlane, Shane DiOrio, and Pete Thorne for giving me permission to use their playing to share the tones of the current brown panel gear. I always try to use the best playing I can find to carry the story forward. I want to thank David Barber, Lau Caldwell, and Carl Carrasco for answering my technical questions from their decades of experience on these unique circuits. Check out the links to everyone's websites in the description. I want to thank everyone that's used the links in the description to support 5 Watt World by buying a t-shirt, hoodie, hat, or a 5 Watt World Barber BUSS Overdrive pedal. And in particular, I need to thank the Friends of 5 Watt on Patreon. It's the guitar community I've always wanted. You're all 5 Watt World. I just make the videos. If you enjoyed this romp through the brown panel combos, then hit the like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that too. Thanks for hanging out with me till the end. Until next time, I'm Keith Williams. Thanks for being a part of the 5 Watt World.